Today we're looking at the book of Isaiah and several of the Messianic prophecies found there. And we're going to focus on a section known as the book of Emmanuel, which is Isaiah chapter 7 through 12. We've already seen through the promises to David in 2 Samuel 7 and then in the Psalms that one of the key themes in Messianic prophecy related to the Davidic throne. We looked at the Messianic restoration in Hosea, the promises there that a future David would rule over a united Israel. And we saw that Paul cites that in Romans 9 and ties that to the conversion of the Gentiles into the New Testament church, or the new Israel. And so we'll also later see, as we develop themes further in Isaiah, that this David promise is found throughout this book as well, and then later on in the prophets Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Well, we'll see a couple of verses here now where the promises to David are to be understood. It's called the book of Emmanuel because of the reading of Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. It's a familiar text. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, a virgin will be with child and bear a son, and she will call his name Emmanuel. The Hebrew word Immanuel means God. El is God. God with us. Immanu, with us. And so this is a promise, and there's a lot of controversy, unfortunately, about the nature of this promise and the nature and timing of the fulfillment. In this first section, we're going to talk about the setting and the scope of the book of Emmanuel, look at some of the background behind the wording of these prophecies, and then we'll develop more fully the specific nature of the Messianic hope found in these chapters. In chapter 7, the Emmanuel prophecy is found in connection with a threat that was very critical in the 8th century BC. You know, every time we study a biblical prophet, we can spend a lot of time looking at the historical background, circumstances, political circumstances of the world. And unfortunately, with Messianic prophecy, we have a whole bunch of prophets we're dealing with, and we could spend quite a bit of time looking at the setting. We're going to have to skip over a number of things. But if you notice in chapter 7, there are certain kings that are mentioned. There is Ahaz, king of Judah, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah, also known as Azariah, king of Judah. And then the king of Syria, Rezin, R-E-Z-I-N, probably pronounced more like Retzion. Syria is another name for Aram, A-R-A-M. The Hebrew name is Aram, and the Greek name is Syria. The Aramaic language, which later became the language that the Jews primarily used, comes from this region of Aram, which is to the north of Israel. We're told that the capital of Syria is Damascus, down in verse 8. So Rezin, I'll call him that, Rezin, the king of Syria in Damascus, and then Pekah, son of Remaliah, king of Israel, wage war, go up to Jerusalem to wage war against it, and could not conquer it. And so there is a coalition. In your outline, it probably says something like the Syro-Ephraimitic coalition. That's what historians have referred to it as. Syro comes from Syria, or Aram. Ephraimitic comes from the name Ephraim. And in the prophets, Ephraim is another name for the northern kingdom of Israel. Ephraim was the most influential chief tribe of Israel. And so Syro-Ephraimitic means a coalition, and in this case also an invasion, of Syria and Israel against the southern kingdom of Judah. And so we learn about some of the names of the kings here. I need to add quickly that this is one of the most difficult periods of Old Testament chronology. The study of the kings and how their dates and reigns tie together at this particular point, the last half of the 8th century BC, is one of the most troublesome of the entire Old Testament period. The Seventh-day Adventist scholar Edwin R. Teeley wrote a book years ago called The Mysterious Numbers of the Hebrew Kings. And in that book, he tries to reconcile these various difficulties concerning the chronology, and what are sometimes referred to as synchronisms, where the reign of a king of Judah and a king of Israel are tied together by the year in which they took the throne with respect to the reign of another king and the duration of those reigns. And for many years, Old Testament scholars have kind of scratched their heads on trying to figure that out. Thiele came up with some really important solutions, one of which was that the recognition that there are co-regencies in the reigns of the kings of Israel and Judah. And so, if the Bible says that King A reigned for 20 years, and he was followed by King B, who also reigned for 20 years, we would assume that the math would work out to be a total reign of 40, and that might be compared, let's say, to the reign of someone in the other kingdom. Well, lo and behold, when the synchronism is made, 20 plus 20 doesn't equal 40, it only equals 30. And so Thiele argued, and he gives good evidence for historical circumstances when this came about in Old Testament history, that kings would often place their son, the heir apparent, on the throne with them and function as a co-regent. We talked a little bit about that in Psalm 2. Thou art my son, today I have begotten you. And we talked about the royal begetting there and how that is fulfilled in the resurrection and ascension of Christ. And so the idea of a co-regency was an important concept. It created stability. There was no doubt as to who the successor would be. And so this problem of co-regency ties into the whole issue of the chronology. It so happens that the reigns of Ahaz and Hezekiah are right at the heart of the most complicated period of the chronology. And we can't go into all of that, but the date for the Syro-Ephraimitic coalition is about 735 to 734 BC. And I think probably the best date to be given to the reign of Ahaz is from 743 BC down to 728, at least as a sole regent, a ruler, and then he may very well have had a co-regency with his son Hezekiah after that. But Ahaz is the focus of the Emmanuel prophecy. Now, that doesn't mean that Ahaz is a king worthy of such attention. Ahaz was one of the worst kings of Judah. He committed idolatry. He set up altars that he borrowed from pagan religions and set them up in Jerusalem. We're even told in 2 Kings 16 that he offered his son as a burnt offering. He caused his son to pass through the fire. And in the Old Testament, there's a number of instances where that is prohibited, but yet we see it practiced, where infant or child sacrifice was practiced by the Israelites, practiced in the name of other gods, and possibly even practiced wrongly in the name of Yahweh or Jehovah God. But Ahaz was one of the worst in Judah. His son Hezekiah, ironically, will be one of the great kings of Judah. So maybe there was a strong reaction to what Hezekiah saw in his father, and he sought to correct that. Other names are listed here, some of which are frankly not known or well known. There's a reference to the son of Tabiel in verse 6, and he seems to have been a person lurking in the shadows who was a pro-Assyrian, an anti-Assyrian figure. The son of Tabiel was apparently one who wanted to cause a revolt. As we think about the setting of this Syro-Ephraimitic coalition, what's at stake in the bigger picture is that Assyria has come to the fore. Tiglath-Pileser III is another name to be reckoned with here. He reigned from 745 to 727. When Tiglath-Pileser came to the throne of Assyria, he developed a new system or program of massive deportation. And so he would go into nations and basically take out tens of thousands of the population and ship them off to other parts of the kingdom. And he did this in mixed and matched populations. He particularly would take out the leadership. and that would weaken the nation that they were taken out of, be easier to control them, and then those leaders sent to another area that had a different religion, a different language, a different culture, they would not be such a force to be reckoned with. And so Tiglath-Pileser initiated this really a change in the way war was done in the ancient Near East. Tiglath-Pileser is the king here as we think about this Syro-Ephraimitic coalition. Rezin and Pekah, kings of Syria and Israel, are wanting to form this union, this coalition, to resist Assyria. And other nations would join in this coalition. And the Assyrian records tell us about some of the conflicts that were fought in connection with this. It was critical for them, apparently, that Ahaz, because Ahaz, king of Judah, was on their southern flank. It was really important that Ahaz be on board with them. And so they basically come to Ahaz with a blackmail saying, if you don't join us, we're going to destroy you. And that's where we are in the setting of Isaiah chapter 7. Now, there are a couple of other historical references along the way. There's a note there, and in our Bibles it's often put in parentheses. The Hebrew language doesn't use parentheses, but it seems to be a parenthetical comment. Chapter 7, verse 8, that within 65 years, Ephraim, that's the northern kingdom, will be shattered so that it is no longer a people. That's a puzzling verse because we know the northern kingdom was conquered in 722 BC. That's when Samaria fell to the Assyrians. So 65 years actually takes us down to about 670 BC. And I frankly admit there is no specific known event that we can point to as the shattering of Ephraim. There is a little bit of a clue, though, however. In the book of Ezra, we read there that the Jews who were, or the people in the land there that were there when the Jews came back from the later Babylonian captivity, those people of the land had been deported by the Assyrians earlier, and they had been there for quite a while. In fact, they say, we have been here since the days of Esarhaddon, who brought us here. Now, Esarhaddon was the Assyrian king who reigned from 681 to 669 BC, and that 670 falls right there in the reign of Esarhaddon. Ezra chapter 4, verse 2 is the text. These people approach Zerubbabel and seek to build the temple along with the Jews who've come back from captivity. And they say that we have been sacrificing to your God ever since the days of Esarhaddon, king of Assyria, who brought us up here. It may be that this major influx of foreigners into Israel was the, quote, shattering of Ephraim. Again, we're not really, the Bible really doesn't specify what the exact fulfillment of that might be. Well, the Lord speaks to Ahaz in verse 10 and offers Ahaz the fulfillment of a sign. Ask a sign for yourself from the Lord your God. And this is a blank check. It's unlimited in scope. Make it deep as Sheol, the abode of the dead, or as high as heaven. Here, God is wanting Ahaz to be firm in his faith, to take a stand, not to resist this coalition. That's one area of temptation. But the other area of temptation, which we will see develop here in the chapters, is that he does not want Ahaz to go to plan B, and plan B for Ahaz is to appeal to Assyria, to go to Tiglath-Pileser himself, the one that these nations around him are so afraid of, and gain help from him. And so in essence, Ahaz is contemplating, and in fact has already contemplated and made the invitation, I believe, the invitation that Tiglath-Pileser come to his aid. This will result in a disastrous consequence for Syria, for Israel, and then also for the nation of Judah. God would seek to avoid that, and he invites Ahaz to offer, to ask for a sign, and he says that he would fulfill that sign. Well, Ahaz is unwilling to ask for a sign. It sounds rather pious, as a pious-sounding response. He says, I will not ask, nor will I test the Lord. Well, this isn't a question of testing God. It's a question of doing what God has asked him to do. And so Ahaz refuses a sign from God. And so now God, in his impatience, listen, O house of David, verse 13, is it too slight a thing for you to try the patience of men, that you will try the patience of my God as well? And so it's very clear here that Ahaz is in a state of disobedience. Ahaz has now forfeited the sign. Whatever we understand about the Emmanuel sign, let's recognize that this is not a sign that will benefit Ahaz. Secondly, as we get into the nature of the promise, earlier it said, is it too slight a thing for you to try the patience of men? But at that point in the text, the singular becomes plural, that you will try the patience of my God as well. You there might be Ahaz and his entire court. And then in Isaiah 7:14, it's very important to note that the you is plural. The Lord himself will give you a sign. This is not a sign only for Ahaz, and certainly is not a sign for the benefit of Ahaz. It is a sign for, at the very least, the court of Ahaz. And I would even suggest it goes broader than that all those who heard that sign and those to whom that sign was reported. This is a promise not just for a limited group of people in Judah. It is a promise to Judah as a whole. And in that promise, we are introduced to the promise of a virgin being with child and bearing a son. Now, there is some debate about how this child relates to a child born in chapter 8. And I want to talk about that child right now for just a moment, and then I want to set this scope of the whole child promise here in the book of Emmanuel, and then we'll come back and we'll specifically focus on the language here of this Emmanuel prophecy. In chapter 7, then, a child is promised, born of a virgin, and we'll look at that Hebrew word alma more in depth here in a minute. And we're given a time reference. It says in verse 16, before the boy knows enough to refuse evil and choose good, the land whose two kings you dread will be forsaken. So there's a limited period of time here. It's the time of a childhood. It's the time in which a child knows to refuse evil and choose good. We're talking about a few years here. And so this few years limitation is tied to the childhood of Emmanuel, but it's also tied to the events that are about to transpire. And therefore some have argued that this must be a child that is born immediately, about to be born or about to be conceived, and that the Emmanuel of Isaiah 7:14 is first an 8th century figure, and then secondarily could refer to the Messiah. Well, that argument is, I think, probably strengthened by what we see in chapter 8. There is another son that is born. We're told specifically, chapter 8, verse 3, so I approached the prophetess, that would be Isaiah's wife, and she conceived and gave birth to a son. And the Lord said to me, name him, now here's one of my favorite Old Testament names, Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz. And no, I guess I shouldn't take off for spelling here. Maher-Shalal-Hash-Baz. Maher means to hurry or swift, as does the word chash, to hasten. Both shalal and baz are words referring to the spoils of war, the prey and the spoils. And so the name means something like hasten to the spoils, hurry to the prey. It's a negative name. This is, in essence, describing the nature of what's going to happen when the Assyrians come into the land. They are going to come like lightning. They're going to come like the eagles in the heavens. They're with horses and chariots, and they are going to come through and they are going to annihilate everything in their path. And so the name is negative, unlike Emmanuel, which is a positive name. But note the time frame in chapter 8, verse 4. Before the boy knows how to cry out, "My father," or "My mother," the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria will be carried away before the king of Assyria. There in chapter 7, it talked about the land whose two kings you dread will be forsaken. I think that's paralleled here by the phrase, the wealth of Damascus and the spoil of Samaria. Now, what happens historically? Well, this is 735, 734. In 732, Damascus, the capital of Syria, is conquered. At that time, Tiglath-Pileser comes into the land, and tribute would have been paid to him probably by Israel as well at this time. In 722, another 10 years later, Samaria will fall. But there were spoils of war, I think, carried off probably before that. Again, though, a limited time frame, the time frame of a child who cries out, "My father, my mother." And in that limited time frame, from birth to the calling out of daddy and mommy, these nations that are threatening Judah will no longer be a threat. And so that theme is found both in chapter 7 and chapter 8. In chapter 7 with reference to Emmanuel, and chapter 8 with reference to Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz. Some therefore have argued that these are two names for the same child. Others have suggested that they are two children who were born roughly at the same time. The question then is should we just simply accept that as an understanding and then take the Messianic applications in the New Testament as purely secondary? I think there are some things in Isaiah itself, in this book of Emmanuel, that suggest to us that perhaps that's not the best approach. Because this theme of a child is found elsewhere in this book of Emmanuel and in other related texts. If we go over to chapter 9 for a moment, and in our next section, I want to try to show how the transitions here in these chapters work, from chapter 8 into chapter 9, from chapter 10 into chapter 11. I think we see a real literary connection here between these promises of gloom and doom that are about to come upon the land at the hands of the Assyrians, and the messianic hope and glory that will someday come to the righteous, to the faithful. And so we'll see how that all ties together. But just by way of introduction, in chapter 9, we are introduced to a child. Handel's Messiah certainly utilized much of the language here in the book of Isaiah. Isaiah 9:6, "For a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders. And his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God." The Hebrew there is El Gibor. "Eternal Father," interesting name for the Messiah, "Prince of Peace. There will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace. On the throne of David," again the Davidic promise again, "on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and uphold it with justice and righteousness. From then on and forevermore, the zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this." And so in the midst of this doom and gloom, the Assyrian threat, we see that there will be a day in the future when the gloom will dissipate. And in fact, the beginning of chapter 9 is cited in Matthew chapter 4, when Jesus settled in at Capernaum. There in Galilee, this was viewed as fulfilling the language of Isaiah here, when it talks about making the northern area glorious by way of the sea on the other side of the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. The people who walk in darkness will see a great light. And so this messianic light is in contrast to the gloom of the Assyrian threat that's upon the nation. So whatever we do with the Emmanuel child in Isaiah 7:14, let's recognize that there is a child in chapter 9 who is to be born. Now, who is this child? Some critics, liberal critics, have argued this is Hezekiah. They do so with a snicker or a smile on their face because they realize that that really doesn't fulfill the nature of this promise. God is promising His people a future ruler who will be just, who will judge righteously, and He will be Prince of Peace. But we can't stop there, though, because if we go on into this book of Emmanuel, we get to chapter 11, and we see another promise in relation to the throne of David. Chapter 11, verse 1, "Then a shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse." And we'll come back to the transitions going on there from chapter 10. "A shoot will spring from the stem of Jesse, and a branch from his roots will bear fruit." One of the messianic titles we see here in prophecy is the concept of a branch. Actually, there are two ideas here, the branch or the shoot. Each of them indicate a new life and something, new growth that has come out of that maybe which is dead or dying. And so the shoot from the stem of Jesse. Now it doesn't say from the stem of David. Could have said that because the Messiah is from the line of David, the seed of David. It says from the stem of Jesse. Well, David obviously was one of Jesse's sons. And so if this comes from the stem of Jesse, then we're talking about a Davidic promise. It's almost as if to say this is not the son of David who is to come, but this is the new David who is to come. Or if we drop down to verse 10, it will come about in that day that the nations will resort to the root of Jesse, who will stand as a signal for the peoples, and his resting place will be glorious. And so there is a descendant of Jesse who is going to rule. And it says that the Spirit of the Lord will rest on him there in 11:2. He is going to judge righteously, verse 3, verse 4. He will judge with righteousness and fairness. And he will strike the earth with the rod of his mouth and slay the wicked with the breath of his lips. Righteousness will be the belt about his loins, and faithfulness the belt about his waist. We'll talk a bit more about the messianic fulfillments here in this chapter. But I just want to set the stage here and to recognize that we don't just have a child in Isaiah 7:14 that's potentially a future fulfillment, but we have the child of Isaiah 9, and we have the shoot coming out of the stem of Jesse here in Isaiah chapter 11. So for me, it's the broader argument from the book of Emmanuel as a whole that makes me give a little more credence to the notion that the Isaiah 7:14 Emmanuel passage is primarily a messianic text. And as I said before, it does not directly apply to Ahaz. The only aspect that relates to Ahaz is this time frame of the infancy, of the childhood. But what was promised to Ahaz was gloom and doom. But to the people, there was promised a ray of hope for the future. And so I think at this point we'll go ahead and pause, and when we come back, we're going to look a little bit more into detail about the nature of the language here in Isaiah 7:14.